Sometimes things that are not true get repeated and retold so often that they come to be accepted as fact. And while it can sometimes be jarring to discover that things you had thought were true for such a long time are actually not true, it can also actually be liberating to find what's actually true. So, I'm sorry if these things rattle your cage this morning, but I need you to know that contrary to popular belief, at the Salem witch trials, no women were burned. No one was burned at the stake, alive or otherwise. No one was burned. I need you to know that bulls are actually colorblind. Not only can they not see the color red, they definitely don't get mad at it when the matador waves the thing. They can't even see any colors at all. I need you to know that Columbus did not actually have ships named the Nina and the Pinta. Nor did he ever step foot on the North American continent, ever. I just need you to know this morning. I also need you to know that the Great Wall of China is not the only man-made structure that can be seen from space. It cannot be seen from space. And finally, and maybe most importantly, I need you to know that Darth Vader never said, "Luke, I am your father." He never said it. Now, these things, they're like legends and they're like myths. They kind of have a life of their own, and they've grown this life because they have some basis in reality, but along the way they've been embellished and they've been distorted and they've been twisted just a little bit. And the true danger of believing something like that, the true danger of this sort of phenomenon is not that we would mix up a few trivial details about popular culture, but actually that our little bite-sized misconceptions would lead us to a wholesale misunderstanding of the significance of those stories in the first place and the things they represent. Now, that danger is certainly present in the story that we're going to study this morning, because this story is the subject of nativity scenes and stained glass windows and Christmas cards and songs the world over, and can be so apparently understood in the popular culture that even for the theologically formed and the biblically illiterate, we can have an idea that we understand the purpose of the story. And yet this morning, as we actually dive into Matthew chapter 2, as we actually unpack the story that the song tells us are about the three kings from the Orient who traveled afar with their gifts, we're going to find that things may not be exactly as we had first reckoned them. First of all, there were not three of them. At least the text doesn't specifically say that there were three of them anywhere. We certainly have no idea if they were on camels or not, and yet somehow that's fixed in our minds. Somewhere along the line in medieval history, they got names: Casper, Balthazar, and Melchior. That is a straight figment of our imagination, nowhere to be found in the text. We actually have very little information about them all. We have no idea exactly where they came from or who they were. But here's the best part of the story, that what we do have in the text is the most important thing about them, and it is the central reason for their visit. That's what we know about them. We know why they came, we know where they went, and we know what they were going to do. And in fact, this morning, we're going to see that the reason for their visit is one of the central reasons for Christmas itself. And on week 2 of Christmas Restored, we need to actually learn from the Magi, from the wise men, the reason for their coming, and we need to adopt their reason for going to Jesus. Because what we're going to see this morning is the big idea that for Christmas to be restored, Christ the King must be crowned. For Christmas to be restored, I'm so thankful for Jeff last week coming and telling us that for Christmas to be restored, the Messiah must be received. This week, for Christmas to be restored, Christ the King must be crowned. You see, in Matthew chapter 2, we're going to see these exotic astrologers who traveled from far away with very expensive gifts, and they endured this entire trip for one reason: to worship Jesus and to crown him with gifts that were befitting his person and his role. And we've made Christmas about a whole bunch of other things. We've made Christmas about gathering family, about receiving gifts, about expressing generosity, about warm sentimentality, about long-standing traditions. And Christmas is actually ultimately about none of those things. Christmas is about crowning a king. And Christmas is about the arrival of that king those thousands of years ago. And so the wise men this morning are going to teach us how to crown the king and what it looks like to crown the king, and we would do well to learn from their example this morning. So let's read God's word, Matthew chapter 2. The verses will be on the screen. If you don't have a Bible with you, don't sweat it. Matthew chapter 2, these are the words of God for us this morning. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of all the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. For Christmas to be restored, Christ the King must be crowned. Matthew, right at the beginning of his gospel, first he gives us the genealogy of Jesus to tie us historically back to his lineage from David. Then immediately after that, he recounts his virgin birth to young Mary. And immediately after the story of the birth, we get this story. And Matthew here is going to hammer what will be one of the central themes throughout his entire gospel, that Jesus is the true king, not just of Israel, but very shockingly and surprisingly here, he's the true king of the entire world. And this king will draw worshipers not just from inside of his ethnic people group, but from every tribe and every tongue and every group of people all around the face of the earth who will crown him as king. And the question for us this morning as we study this text is, how can I know if I've crowned him? How will I know if Jesus is the king of my life, if I have gotten off my throne and placed him on the throne and given him the crown and made him king? What will evidence that I have crowned the king? And we're going to see 4 ways in the text. We have 3 characters that are going to give us 4 ways to recognize when we have crowned the king. And we're going to do it this way. The first one is this: crowning the king motivates my movement toward Jesus. Crowning the king motivates my movement toward Jesus. Look again at verse 1. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king," we'll get to that later, "behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" Now that right there, those 2 verses, are really all the biblical data we have on these men at all. So we've already established the fact that we know, in fact, very little about them, but the question remains, what do we know? What do we know about these guys? Well, here's the only things we really know from the text. We know this. We know that these were very, very wealthy star studiers who came from a pagan land to the east of Israel, and they traveled a long way to Israel's capital, to the city of Jerusalem, because they had seen a star. And to them, that signified a king that had been born that was to be worshiped. That's all we know about them. The word here also has been translated magi. This is the word where we get our word magic. It's the same word. These guys were sorcerers of sorts. There are these, like our best historical reconstructions of who they are, and this is outside of the text. But these magi, these sorcerers, they most likely were from Persia, and they were probably really wealthy aristocrats who were part of this ruling class in Babylon at the time. And they're sort of this weird hybrid between scientists and theologians. They're studying and worshiping, but they're also doing what we would consider now kind of this hybrid of astronomy and astrology, like the more technical science of like studying the position of celestial bodies, but they're also coupling that with this very superstitious study of the fact that those stars and planets portend earthly events, and they're trying to predict them. They're like sorcerers. They're astrologists. And if you love to just geek out over like trying to line up historical realities with biblical realities, these guys and the star that they followed is like a dream for you. If you love to like dig in and try to find like, man, what country were they from and what star was it? People have done all kinds of work on this. All of it is speculative at the very best, but there's all kinds of fascinating work that's been done on trying to understand who exactly they were, where exactly they came from, how they knew the star was supposed to point them to Israel, and what the star was. Like, what was it that they saw? So all these astronomers have gone to work and tried to line up, like, was it Jupiter and Saturn that lined up perfectly at this moment and pointed them directly towards Israel? And is that gonna happen again, like in 2 days or something? I have no idea, but astronomers are crazy about it. And there's like whole books that have been written trying to tie which star or which planet is in this text, which is awesome. And then there's also what I think is even more fascinating than that is the question, how did these guys from like hundreds of miles away in Persia, how did they know that the bright light they saw in the sky was supposed to take them to Israel? And there is equally fascinating conjecture about that. What I think is one of the most fascinating hypotheses is that when Daniel was in exile in Babylon, there's actually a couple verses that tie him in relationship to men who would have been like this. And so there's this idea that when Daniel was in Babylon and he was in exile, that he left behind, because of his influence, this messianic expectation and hope. And there are verses like in Numbers 24:17 that talk about how a star will rise out of Israel and a scepter will come out of Judea. And so somehow these sorcerers, essentially these magicians from Persia, they see a sign in the sky and they decide a king has been born in Israel and we are gonna go worship him. That's the point. That's all we really have about them. And what we can confidently guess is that these gentlemen, they traveled a very long distance with a very large caravan. You can forget 3 guys on camels. This was probably an entourage that was rolling about 800 miles to come and worship this newborn king. Now, you kind of have to wonder why they went to such great lengths. Like, I was reading this week, there's a convention. It's the biggest comic book convention in the world. It's in San Diego. It's called Comic-Con. Maybe you've heard of it. 130,000 people descend upon San Diego to just like turn the nerd factor up to 1,000 and talk about comic books and action characters and movies, and they dress up and it's like wild. I'm a closet nerd. I think I would love to be there. But here's the thing about Comic-Con. It is wild the lines that are there. Like, people will go and they will camp out outside this convention center in San Diego for multiple days. They will camp overnight, like with, I don't know, canned beans for sustenance or something, and they will just wait to get into Comic-Con. And then you actually find out, here's the wildest part of it. They don't just camp, because I can get that, like you camp for something that you're really passionate about. You find out that some of the people in the front of the line, they're camping, and after 3 or 4 days of camping, you're like, man, what are you so excited to go do? They're like, when I get in the convention, I'm gonna go wait in another 18-hour line. They're waiting in line to wait in a line for a particular like panel or event that they want to do inside the thing. It's like, you did what? For what? You sure you couldn't catch that on YouTube? Or you had to be there in person? It was worth 5 days of your life. Now, I have to imagine that the amused kind of shock and confusion for these Comic-Con fans was a little bit resemblant of what these guys would have received when they told their friends and family what they were going to do. Like, imagine being one of these dudes and you got to tell your wife what trip you're going on. She's like, you're going where? For how long? With who? To do what? Like, these guys are taking this massive group of people all the way across the Middle East, and they're going to do it because they're convinced there's a baby who not will be a king one day, but who in his diapers is a king right now, and they're gonna go worship him. And they're bringing stacks of cash with them to just throw at his feet. It is a little bit strange, but these guys are convinced that it was worth it. They're convinced, they were motivated, they were compelled to move towards Jesus, this newborn king, and to worship him. I wonder this Christmas season, because I wonder it for myself, these guys were willing to go to great lengths, at great cost and great inconvenience, just to get to the little bit that they knew about baby Jesus. What kind of minor inconveniences keep us from pursuing Jesus at all? What kind of things do we allow to stand in our way of making any sort of movement towards Christ? They had a glimmer of hope in the sky that there was a king, and we know the king by name. We know his person, we know his work, we know his glory, we know who he is and what he's done, and yet we will allow our warm bed or our hatred of our alarm clock or the fact that we ran out of time to keep us from pursuing him at all. And I think when we read a story like this, these guys in God's kindness, they shame us by their willingness to go. They went like 800 miles, and we can't walk down the hall to sit in a chair and open God's word and seek the King Jesus who was born at Christmas. And I'm just telling you that if you will crown the King, if Christmas will be restored in your heart and your life because Christ the King gets crowned, it will motivate your movement towards him. You will remove any obstacle. You will get anything out of the way if you can just get to the King to worship him. So let's let the example of the Magi motivate our movement towards Jesus. No matter the cost, no matter the inconvenience, let's move towards Christ because we have crowned him the King. It's the first evidence that the King has been crowned. It motivates our movement towards Jesus. The second evidence is this: crowning the King crushes my kingship against Jesus. Look down at verse 3. Crowning the King crushes my kingship against Jesus. Now we're going to meet the second character in the story. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. Herod was called Herod the Great, and he was a Roman appointed governor in the region of Judea and over the Jewish people. This guy was a skilled builder and a very skilled military commander who had done some great things, including rebuilding the Jerusalem temple. But Herod the Great was also notoriously insecure and paranoid and violent, and that is how history remembers him. History remembers him for some terrible, horrendous things that he did, like he was known to have killed his mother-in-law and 3 of his children, and the mother of those children, his very own wife. He killed all of them at separate times because of loose suspicions of insurrection, that at one time, in one way, they would take his throne or try to usurp his authority, so he just killed them all. This guy was an awful dude, and he was murderously insecure. When his life was nearing its end, he was well aware of the fact that no one would mourn his death. And so he had a group of innocent citizens arrested, and he gave an order that on the day he died, they would be executed so that people would mourn. So this guy's like as bad as it gets. And so you can imagine this guy who is deeply insecure and afraid of losing the power that was so dear to him over this little region of Judea, he is rightfully troubled when this caravan of rich and powerful men from the east, they show up on the scene and they say, hey, we're here to worship the new king. And Herod knew full well that the kind of king they were talking about, the kind of king that would come from David's throne, who have a legitimate claim to be the heir, he would have a much stronger claim to the authority in that region and over those people than Herod himself had. And so he's immediately threatened. He immediately goes into his paranoid, insecure mode and wants to exterminate the threat. So what he does is he immediately poses as if he's interested in also finding the king. We're going to see in a few verses that he says he wants to worship. But we'll discover even later in Matthew, though it's not part of our text this morning, that instead of going to worship, he actually had a plan to go into the region and to kill all of the baby boys that were 2 years old and younger. Maybe the worst of all the things that he had done. Now, the story says that he was troubled. That he was troubled. And then it also says that all Jerusalem was troubled with him. Now, why was all of Jerusalem troubled? Well, you can imagine such an unstable and childish and vengeful dictator. He would produce a reaction from people, because when he got into his fits of rage or his fits of paranoia, you can imagine that the people would get scared when he got mad, because bloodshed was bound to happen. And so he frightens all of the people by his reaction. And the reality here that we see is that Herod, he had built up this kingship that was immediately threatened by and opposed by the kingship of Jesus. Herod's kingship was built in opposition. His central identity was not built on the goodness and faithfulness of God, who would send a newborn king, who would send a Messiah. He was built on his own autonomy and his own authority and his own position. It was the thing that he clung to and that he held most dear. So this arrival of King Jesus, which the angels called good news for all men everywhere, because he's bringing glad tidings of peace, instead, he hears the news of the newborn king and it turns his stomach. To him, it's an impending threat that needs to be done away with, not good news of great joy. And here's what's so potent about this. If you're paying attention to the story and you know at all who Jesus is, you are seeing here a powerful contrast. You are seeing a tale of two kings, if you will. You're seeing one king who is selfish and insecure and arrogant and angry, and he is clinging with everything he can, even murderous venom. He's holding on with all of his might to his earthly reign. And in the backdrop of this story is another king who is selfless and who is loving and who at this very time has given up the glory and the comfort of heaven to come down to the earth, to live and to die, to rescue sinners from death and from hell. Not to hold on to his power and to try to establish some sort of earthly reign, but to give up his power for the sake of others, to establish his heavenly reign on the earth. These are the two kings that are being contrasted here, and it is powerful. One of them is pathetic and insecure, and one of them is awe-inspiring and worship-inducing. It's the King Jesus. And every day of our lives, there is a similar battle that rages inside of us. There are two rulers that are clamoring for the throne of our lives, and only one can sit. Only one can rule. And too often in our sinfulness, you and I clamber up onto the throne of our lives, and we sit there and we say, I'm in charge, and I call the shots, and I say what goes. But the reality that we're confronted with is that either you will grasp onto your throne and your authority in opposition to Jesus, or you will step off of your throne and you will surrender completely in submission to him. Those are the only two options. Jesus will either not be in charge of your life because you have retained the authority for yourself and you sit on the throne, or Jesus will crush and obliterate your kingship as you submit to him. Now, this is an uncomfortable idea. To crown Jesus as the king means our kingship is over. It means our rule and reign is done. And that's a very uncomfortable idea, that we have to actually surrender control and surrender authority to someone else. But it is actually the most beautiful idea, because here's the good news. To crown Jesus as king of your life, yes, it means you surrender your authority and your autonomy completely. But here's the good news. You do not surrender your authority to a cruel tyrant like Herod. You are surrendering your authority to a Savior King like Jesus, who loves you so much that during this story, he is sitting 6 miles south in the town of Bethlehem as a little baby boy who gave up all of the power and position of being with his Father in heaven in glory forever, and he came on a redemptive mission, and he became what he created so that he could die in our place and rescue us. And that's the king that you submit to. You don't get a choice about whether or not you will submit to authority. You're submitting your life to something. Don't you want to submit it to a king like that? A king who loves you so much he would give his life for you. A king who lives and dies so you can be free, so you can have life, so your cold, dead heart can be woken up and all your sin can be wiped away and your eyes can be opened and you can be adopted into his family. That's your king. It's King Jesus. So my plea with you this morning would be, let your kingship be crushed. Get off of the throne. Just give up clasping and holding on and gripping your own way and your own power and your own authority, and just get off the throne and submit to Jesus, because it's better. Let your kingship be crushed and joyfully submit to our loving King Jesus. That's the second way that you'll know that you've crowned the king. That your kingship is over. It's been crushed. You're done away with all your authority, and it all belongs to Jesus with joy. Here's the third way. Crowning the king ruins my religion without Jesus, motivates my movement toward Jesus, crushes my kingship against Jesus, and third, it ruins my religion without Jesus. Look down at verse 5 in our story. So Herod has just gathered the scribes and the chief priests, and he asked them where the Christ, that's the Messiah, where he was to be born. And verse 5 says, they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, Herod had gathered the professional theologians and the Bible scholars. That's who these guys are. They're the religious experts, the chief priests and the scribes. And he summoned them for a little impromptu meeting to ask them this question: where is the Messiah going to be born? And apparently, without flinching or even having to think twice about it, they've got the answer right off the top. They were like Awana kids, #1 sword drillers. They were just the best Bible heads of all time. They got the answer right off the top. It makes the raging know-it-all inside of me very happy. When someone asks me a question and I know the answer, I'm like, oh yes, I get to show you how much I know. And these guys know a lot. They instantly have the answer. They know exactly where the Messiah is going to be born. And so they quote to him Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, which talks about Bethlehem. And it says, "You, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Bethlehem was a little town 5 or 6 miles south of Jerusalem. It was known for being the birthplace of King David, but it was relatively inconspicuous at the time. It wasn't a huge deal. There wasn't a lot going on, which is why the prophecy says, you are by no means least among the rulers, for from you shall come a ruler. These religious experts, they knew the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. And here's the point of quoting Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. It would have been pretty clear to the theologically informed what that quotation meant. It meant this, that the son of David is going to be born in the town of David to rule God's people just like David. It was the cornerstone of messianic hope, that one from the line of David, who was supposed to sit on his throne forever and restore God's people, he was going to show up, and he was going to do it in the town of David in Bethlehem. This was no less than an announcement of the arrival of the Messiah. It's the long-awaited hope of rescue for God's people in the arrival of his anointed servant. It's the greatest news that this nation has ever heard, and these men, these religious experts, they appear altogether unaffected and indifferent. This is the announcement of Israel's hope and their longing and their expectation for a rescuer and a deliverer. And these guys show up, and Herod asks, hey, where is the Messiah going to be born? And these guys are like, we're pretty sure the Messiah's been born. And it's crickets from these religious elite. Nothing. Now, imagine the surprise of these men, these magi. Remember, they've gone through this great sacrifice. They've gathered all these people. They've traveled all this way. Imagine their surprise when they roll up to Jerusalem, the capital city where they expected this king to be born, and there is no fireworks. There is no parade. There is no fanfare. There is actually nothing going on. Not only is newborn king not trending on Twitter, no one has even tweeted about it. No YouTube ads running, no Facebook event to RSVP to, nothing happening. They walk in and it's quiet. I imagine they probably thought, like, are we in the wrong place? We came to worship the king who is born to rule the world, and we've got really expensive things to bring him. And imagine they're walking around, they're like, hey, have you heard about the king? Do you know where the king is going to be born? We saw a star, we came here, we're here to worship him, we have all these gifts. Do you know where the king was born? And just over and over again, they heard, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Apparently, they have to get all the way to the palace and all the way to Herod to get their question answered. And when they finally get there, they are met with cold indifference and complete inactivity. Imagine this. Imagine this. These scribes were perfectly fine to give some intellectual acknowledgement, but couldn't be troubled to give any investigation or pursuit. The text doesn't tell us that a single one of them followed the Magi when they went to Bethlehem, or that any one of them was even curious or remotely interested in doing anything to respond to this amazing truth. Somehow, the hallmark of their religion had become indifference. In fact, I'm pretty confident that if the true Messiah did arrive, it would actually kind of mess up the thing they had going on. They were pretty comfortable. They had a pretty cush job. They were, they studied the Bible all the time, and they taught people, and they had a lot of power. They didn't really need things to be shaken up by the arrival of the Messiah, and so they just appear not to care at all. The problem is that they seem to have lost the beating heart and the central reason that their position existed in the first place. The reason to study the Jewish scriptures was the longing for a Messiah to come, and these guys show up and they're like, the king is here, and they just don't care. It's like a master class in missing the point. I wish this story was fake. It's not fake. There is a school in New York called Union Theological Seminary. It's in Manhattan. And last fall, in September of 2019, they sent out this series of tweets that were showing off these pictures of a chapel service where students and faculty, if you don't believe me, you can go look this up. Students and faculty were gathered around and they were confessing their climate sins, and they were repenting and praying to potted plants. Again, I wish I was making it up. Go Google it later. It's called Union Theological Seminary, and the students were gathered around, and there are people kneeling in front of a pile of dirt where there are potted plants, and they are praying to the potted plants and asking their forgiveness for our offenses against them. Now, there are a lot of bad words I could say about that. I'm not going to say any of them. This academic institution, which was founded in 1836 to honor Jesus and to teach the scriptures and to train ministers in the gospel, is now praying to plants. Somewhere along the line, the central reason for this institution's existence was completely lost. And so now, even though they're called Union Theological Seminary, it hardly feels fair to call them theological or a seminary. What are they doing? They're praying to plants. They've lost the central point entirely. What happened is clearly, somewhere along the line, they removed Jesus entirely and just went on about their business. And so now they have the form of a thing that was about Jesus but is no longer. And I wonder if the same thing could be said about our lives at times. I wonder if, like these religious elite in our story and like Union Theological Seminary, if at some point you just completely removed the person and the work of Jesus, would our business go on as usual? Would our lives go on unaffected? Would our celebration of Christmas look exactly the same if you just remove Jesus from the equation? Because if that's the case, we have a religious system that is completely apart from Jesus, and it needs to be ruined by our crowning of the King again, to remember that the reason we celebrate this holiday and the reason we have a church is not for any of the external trappings. It's not just for the sermons and the songs and the buildings and the people and the events. It's for the King. And if we set up any sort of system that would carry on without him, that system needs to go away and the King needs to come back, even if it's only the King. The religious systems we apparently build, just like these chief priests and scribes, they need to be ruined. Let them be ruined and let them be replaced by the King. Let's crown him again. And let's refuse to just go through the motions and just sing the songs and play the parts and attend the services and claim the titles, but ultimately have a position of take it or leave it indifference toward Jesus. Let's not be like these men. If we crown the King, our religion without Jesus will be ruined, and let it be so. Because what replaces it is so much more glorious. And what replaces it is the last evidence, the fourth evidence of what it means to crown the King, and it's this: crowning the King awakens my worship of Jesus. It awakens my worship of Jesus. Verse 7, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So Herod gathers these men. He asks them when the star appeared, because we know he wants to actually try to gauge how old the child is. And then he sends them and says, hey, when you find him, come back and talk to me. And at this point in the story, apparently the star, which had led them to Israel, had disappeared for a bit, but it reappears now, not just to lead them to a general geographic region, but actually to lead them directly to the house where Jesus is. So even if at some point there was like Jupiter and Saturn, this obviously is some sort of supernatural phenomenon, because it doesn't just lead them to a place or in a direction, it leads them to a house. Now, notice it says house, which means that this story takes place not at the stable or in the manger, as our nativity scenes might like to tell us. This takes place at some interval later, probably at least several months. And Mary and Joseph have moved into a house, and they're temporarily staying in this area, and the wise men are directed by the star to the home. And at this point in the story, we've already seen two people who should be predisposed to receive this news with joy, but instead they react out of opposition and indifference. And now these Persian astrologists are going to show us exactly what you should do when you meet this king. It's worship. It's worship the king. So how do they worship him? Just 4 ways really quickly. The first way is this: they joyfully seek him. Verse 10 says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They sought him with joy. I love when the Bible does stuff like this. It's just like stacking up as many words to tell you they were happy as possible. This is like 4 times supersize me, quadruple, mega awesome, extra joy. That's how joyful they were. That's how pumped they were to be following the star and to get to the newborn king. They're like, so full of joy to seek after Jesus, and they worship him in their seeking him. Number 2, they not only joyfully seek him, they humbly bow before him. Verse 11, they went into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Now, I love this. I won't make a big deal of it, but look, they see Mary and they see the child. They see 2 people, and they choose to only worship one. And they worship the way more unlikely of the 2. They worship the baby. They fall down humbly in reverence before this newborn king, and they worship him. And then number 3, they give generously to him. They give generously to him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They truly give him gifts fit for a king. Now, a lot in interpretive history has been made of these gifts and what they represent. Really, it's a precious metal, and then it's incense and oils. But these are just things that are very, ludicrously expensive at the time. And that's what you're really supposed to get from this story, is they give him essentially what amounts to now like a pile of cash. They give him unbelievable amounts of resources. They make Joseph and Mary rich with these gifts. And in God's providence, we're going to see in just a couple verses, if you keep reading in Matthew, Mary and Joseph are going to have to flee to Egypt, which would be, by any account, an expensive endeavor. And Joseph is a tradesman who probably couldn't afford that trip. And in God's providential care for Mary and Joseph, he has just brought them a bunch of money to fund their exile to Egypt and their safe return home. These guys worship him with their gifts. But notice that they don't worship him and then give gifts. Their giving of gifts is worship. And appropriately so. Their extravagant display of generosity, just like other places in the scripture, like the woman of the city who breaks the expensive perfume and pours it on Jesus' feet. They're just lavishly giving to Jesus, and none of it is wasted. And so it is when we give. We give and give, whether it's our resources or our talents or our time. We give and give and give to Jesus, and he receives it all with joy. And then the 4th way they worship, they obediently protect him. Verse 12, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. They were warned in a dream, apparently by God, not to go back to Herod because that would jeopardize Jesus' life. And so they protect him by kind of skirting around and evading Herod's watch and getting away back to their land without Herod noticing. I love this expression. These guys show us the way to worship. They joyfully seek him. They humbly bow before him. They generously give to him. And I wonder, could those things be descriptions of the way we worship Jesus, especially right now? Do we joyfully seek after him, and do we generously give to him? Do we seek after him and humbly worship him with everything that we've got and with all that we are, like these guys do? Because if you have crowned Jesus the King of your life, it will awaken again that sense of worship in you. Worship is just assigning worth, and we need to assign worth to Jesus this time of year and every time of year. Is it obvious to the people around you that Jesus is the most valuable thing in your life? Is it very clear by the way you live and the way you give and the way you operate and your words and your habits? Is it obvious that Jesus has the center place, that he is the most important thing? Because that's what happens when you crown the King. Crowning the King motivates my movement towards Jesus. It crushes my kingship against Jesus. It ruins my religion without Jesus, and it awakens my worship of Jesus. Well, let's learn to live. I want to give you a couple questions. This is something we do each week. We want to learn from God's word, and then we want to live in accordance with God's word. And so I'm going to give you 3 questions that you can take to a group or over coffee, or you can take to your journal, and you can work on applying this truth to your life. The first one is this: what's my relationship to the King? What's my relationship to the King? Have you crowned Jesus as the King of your life? I don't want you to pretend or just assume that by virtue of the fact that you are in a church today that you have a right relationship with Jesus. You only have a relationship with him as your King if you have made a decision to humbly bow before him and surrender the authority of your life to him. And if today you know you're in this room and you know you've got a kingship against Jesus and you've got a religion without Jesus, it is not too late for you to respond to the invitation to crown Jesus as King of your life. You can do it right now. You can submit to him, get off the throne, crown him as the King, and he will rescue you and save you and forgive you. He'll do it today. Second question: what cheapens the King this Christmas? What in our lives do we allow to devalue Jesus at Christmas? What other things are we emphasizing? What other priorities do we have that detract from the main thing? Is it the traditions that we have, or is it sin that we harbor in our life? We need to actively work to make sure that nothing is cheapening our celebration of the reason of Christmas, that we're restoring Christmas to the glory that it's always had by crowning the King. And then the last question: how will I compel others to crown my King? The very reason that we are alive on this earth serving this King is so that other people would know him. How, in this season especially, how will you work to compel others to know your King and to crown him in their lives? Because that's why you're alive if you're a follower of Jesus. So think about how you can do that, who you can pray for, who you can invite, who you can share the gospel with, who you can sacrificially love to demonstrate the love of your King for them. Take those questions and meditate on them, journal them, think about them, talk about them, and I pray that God will use them to strengthen us and make our lives look more like the lives of these wise men. Though this story is often misunderstood, it's often misapprehended, the true story, I think, is even more shocking and surprising than the commonly misunderstood one. I think it's so fascinating in this story that the religious experts and the political rulers, they're the ones who get it wrong. And the ones who get it right are the least likely of all. They are Middle Eastern, Far Eastern astrologers, and they get it right. And they come from a Gentile country in a pagan land to worship a baby king who is so captivating and so compelling that since this very day, he has still been drawing people from all the ends of the earth, no matter where they come from or what nation they're from or what their profession is. I mean, God spoke in dreams to magicians and sorcerers to compel them to come and worship Jesus. And it's a beautiful foreshadowing of what the rest of the book of Matthew will tell us, that God is bound and determined to reach people to the ends of the earth. And he will go to great lengths to do it. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, God sent his son so he could be your king. No matter who you are, you will respond to this news of the arrival of the Messiah in some way. You will crown the king. You will crown some king. You will either, in opposition and hatred, you will oppose Jesus, or you will be indifferent and you will ignore Jesus, or you will crown and adore Jesus. God help us to be wise like these wise men and to crown the King of Christmas. Let's pray.